morning, everyone. Today, we're going to shift focus a bit. Over the past 2 weeks, we looked at what it meant for God to be trustworthy, and I argued that God is trustworthy, or that it's at least rational or reasonable to trust God. But over the next 2 weeks, we are going to be assuming that God is, in fact, trustworthy, and then asking, how do we trust God? We'll be asking, how do we help ourselves recognize the fact that God is trustworthy? Because we've assumed that He is and argued that He is. How do we help ourselves appreciate the fact of God's trustworthiness in a way that shapes our emotions and behaviors and brings them in line with that fact? So in week 1, we defined trust as a volitional inference that bridges a gap that would otherwise exist between evidence and belief. When we say that trust is a volitional inference, we just mean that it's a way of thinking and we have a choice about that way of thinking. For the past few weeks, we've been focusing on the evidence and the inference parts of trust. But now we're going to be looking at the volitional part. How do we choose to trust God? Now, remember we saw in week 1 that our choice to trust isn't like turning a switch on or off, but we can still choose to nurture or to starve trust. So, when we ask, how do we trust? How do we choose to trust? We'll largely be looking at ways to nurture our trust. Now, it just so happens that we can nurture our trust in God by looking at evidence for God's trustworthiness. So we will be looking at evidence, but I will not be presenting that evidence in argumentative form. And if you're not a Christian, I fully expect that the evidence I'm presenting over the next 2 weeks will be entirely unpersuasive. So, all of this means that if you're joining us for the first time, you will feel like I am assuming quite a bit, and that is in fact true. But whether this is the first video you're watching or whether you've been watching all of them, I do think it would be helpful for us to review some of what we've learned about trust before we then transition into asking, how do we trust? How do we nurture trust? So we've been using 2 examples to help us understand what it is that makes someone trustworthy. The first is on the left here. It's the example of a trust fall. The key question here is, who would you trust to catch you if you did a trust fall with them? And of course, a trust fall is something where you close your eyes, hold out your hands on either side of you to make the shape of a T, and then fall backwards. So who would you trust to catch you in that type of exercise? Well, you would only trust someone to catch you if that person was good enough to try to catch you, and then also capable enough to actually be able to catch you. And this capability thing means both that they would have to be strong enough to catch you, but also that they would have to know certain things, like when you're going to fall, and they'd have to avoid other things, like getting distracted. So that's why this second question here about capability is phrased in terms of control of the situation. Then we also looked at the example of 2 spies. Now, both of these spies are good and capable. They're like morally upright versions of James Bond. But these spies are working for countries that are at war with each other. They're not working towards the same goals, and that means they can't trust each other. Because they're in opposition to each other, because they're not on the same team, they can't trust each other. They fundamentally disagree about what is good and what should happen. And basically, the issue here is they're not on the same team. And even as players who are on opposing teams in a sporting match will try to trick each other, even though they're not horrible people. So these 2 spies, even though they're not horrible people, can't trust each other. So this one thing that is important to notice is that there are these 3 things that determine whether or not someone is trustworthy. And 2 of them are totally about the person who we are trusting. Character and capability are just about the person who is the recipient of the trust. But commonality is a question that involves both the person who is being trusted and the person who is doing the trusting. This means that who we can trust depends in part on who we are and what we think is good. It depends on what team we're on. This is why, as we saw last week, whether or not God is trustworthy for you and me depends on whether we are on God's team. Whether or not God is trustworthy for you and me depends on whether we choose to be on God's team, whether we choose to say, God, what you say is good, I say is good, and what you say is bad, I say is bad. Whether or not God is trustworthy for you and me depends on whether we choose to be on God's team, accept his game plan, and play by his playbook. So, someone's trustworthiness depends on character, capability, and commonality. But how do we actually trust someone? Well, as we go through life, I think we come to trust people in two basic ways. The first is what I like to call a brother-in-arms situation. I call it that because soldiers often have this kind of trust. They go through a crisis together, often a very brief period of time, and their brothers in arms, their teammates, demonstrate their character and their capabilities under extreme pressure. This creates a strong bond of trust. But we also come to trust in more sort of mundane and everyday ways, and this is what I like to call the mother and baby situation. This is a situation where someone demonstrates their values, their character, and their capabilities over a long period of time, not in a time of crisis, but just as we go through life. So basically, we come to trust someone by getting to know them, which is then how we learn about their character and their capabilities, and we get to know them either through a short time of crisis or through a longer period of ordinary life. Now, over the past 3 weeks, we assumed that Jesus was God, and then said, if that is true, God has demonstrated his character and capability through a brother-in-arms situation. I argued that in a time of crisis, God demonstrated his character by sacrificing himself for us, and then by rising from the dead. And rising from the dead demonstrated his capability to conquer death and to offer everyone the opportunity to share in his victory over death by joining his team. But over the next few weeks, we're going to be getting away from this brother-in-arms crisis situation and focusing on more everyday, mundane ways of getting to know God and learning about his character and capabilities. So, let's get back to our definition of trust. Trust is a volitional inference that bridges a gap that would otherwise exist between evidence and belief. We have evidence about someone's character and capability through these two basic ways of getting to know them. And that evidence allows us to, for instance, form beliefs about all sorts of things, including someone's future behavior. So take the example of doing a trust fall with someone who you believe will catch you. And let's say that that belief is true. They actually will catch you. We don't have any direct evidence about the future, so there is a gap between the evidence you have and your belief that in the future your partner will catch you. So how do you get from your evidence to your belief? Well, you get there via trust. You get there by way of trust. Trust bridges that gap. And it's been my contention that trust is a legitimate way of bridging that gap. That you actually can walk across the bridge of trust without sacrificing your rationality, your reasonability, or your cognitive faculties. In this video, we're going to be talking about exactly that kind of trust. Trust that bridges the gap between the past and the future. So it's exactly like trusting someone based on what you know of them from the past to then catch you in the future. We're going to see that we can choose to trust God with the future by remembering and focusing on his past trustworthiness. So D.A. Carson put it this way: believers who spend no time reviewing and pondering in their minds what God has done, whether they are alone and reading their Bibles or joining with other believers in corporate adoration, should not be surprised if they rarely sense that God is near. Now, Carson, of course, uses the phrase sense that God is near, and I think this is pretty close to saying sense God's trustworthiness. Carson is saying here that if we don't remember and ponder and review what God has done, then we won't sense God's trustworthiness. Now, what I think is really interesting is this sort of trust about the future based on the past is modeled in the Bible. It's the basis for these instructions in Deuteronomy 6. In the future, when your son asks you, "What is the meaning of the stipulations, decrees, and laws the Lord our God has commanded you?" tell him, "We were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Before our eyes the Lord sent signs and wonders, great and terrible, on Egypt and Pharaoh and his whole household. But he brought us from there to bring us in and give us the land he promised on oath to our ancestors. The Lord commanded us to obey all these decrees and to fear the Lord our God, so that we might always prosper and be kept alive, as is the case today. And if we are careful to obey all this law before the Lord our God, as he has commanded us, that will be our righteousness." Excuse me. So, there's an imagined situation here where a child asks, "What is the meaning of these things, these commands?" And the response is, well, God has shown himself to be trustworthy in the past. He has demonstrated his capabilities by powerfully delivering the children of Israel from Egypt, and he has demonstrated his character by keeping the promises that he made to our ancestors. And now, God has given us these commands so that we will flourish in the future. So one thing that I think is really interesting here is that, yes, trusting God requires saying, "God, I'm on your team and I follow your playbook." But this isn't a mechanistic forced thing. God's not being dictatorial. Obedience is a natural expression of trust. And we foster that trust. We foster trusting obedience by remembering God's past trustworthiness, his past demonstrations of his character and his capabilities. So Psalm 78 does something very similar. It reads, the beginning of it reads, "My people, hear my teaching. Listen to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth with a parable. I will utter hidden things, things from of old, things we have heard and known, things our ancestors have told us. We will not hide them from their descendants. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power, and the wonders he has done. He decreed statutes for Jacob and established the law in Israel, which he commanded our ancestors to teach to their children, so the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born, and they in turn would tell their children. Then they would put their trust in God and would not forget his deeds, but would keep his commands. They would not be like their ancestors, a stubborn and rebellious generation, whose hearts were not loyal to God, whose spirits were not faithful to him." And then the rest of the psalm goes on to recount the history of Israel, continually contrasting God's trustworthiness with his people's lack of trust in him. I recommend that you just go ahead and read the rest of the psalm this week. It's a bit too long for us to fit in today. One thing that I just think is mind-blowingly fascinating here is that you have this instruction in the book of Deuteronomy, right, where God says, teach these commands to your children, and when they ask you about them, explain these commands to them in this way. And then you have Psalm 78, which is then taking up this instruction later on in the history of the children of Israel. And it is recounting God's deeds and explaining God's commands with the express purpose that they would put their trust in God and would not forget his deeds, but would keep his commands. So you have this sort of initial instruction, and then you have the implementation of that instruction modeled in the history of the children of Israel and modeled in the Bible for us to look at and learn from. So, just to recap, in this video, we asked, how do we trust God? How do we nurture our trust in God? And we saw that we can trust God by remembering his trustworthiness throughout history, his past trustworthiness. And an important element of remembering this, because it's often hard to just control our thoughts in and of themselves, is to rehearse God's past trustworthiness, to actively review it in our minds and talk about it with other people. And that bit, talking about it with other people, touches on what we'll cover in our next video.